I think a lot of people are beginning to stray away from the true definition of power rankings and what they actually do signify. For the most part, power rankings are done by stats, head-to-head comparisons, and pretty much little opinion. Power rankings by no means are predictions. They are merely something to look at in terms of where teams stand based on the matches that they've played. Like I said, barely any opinion is thrown in that whatsoever. They're done solely by the matches that have taken place and pretty much normally put into an algorithm, and that is how they are laid out. By no means do you normally put a ton of opinion in power rankings. So I don't want to come into this video, or rather to this segment, and start saying, oh, well, I do or I don't agree with the power rankings, because if they are done by analytics for the most part, there isn't really anything that you can argue based upon what the algorithm has laid out. So I'd rather today go over which teams I think coming into CWL Fort Worth have the ability to either, based on the power rankings, rise, or based on the power rankings, to lower. So first, I want to talk about a few teams that I think have the ability to raise in the power rankings, like I said, through CWL Fort Worth, and that very first team is Luminosity. Now, I personally have been a big critique of this team. I have been someone who has said multiple times this team didn't make the right roster change coming into this title, and while I still do believe that, I am still interested in this team because I think that they do have the capability to eclipse the top four. And I say that very, very carefully. I say that knowing everything that we have, knowing how they did in the Pro League, heading in from week 1 to week 2, the way they started and the way that they ended were two totally different teams, a much different squad. So don't get me wrong, we didn't see enough necessarily to justify them being a top 4 team. The way that they played versus Genji, the way they played versus Midnight and Optic, for me, were somewhat of a proof to show that they can do big things. Not necessarily top 4 things, but I'm looking kind of more in the retrospect as far as what could be done in the future. So I definitely agree with their position for the most part in the power rankings, but I think they absolutely have the capability to be higher. Like I said, I've been a big critique on this team. I thought that the internal problems would really get to them, and I think at times it has, and I'm not sure how long they'll last for, but based off the talent of this group, based off of the skill ceiling that this team has, it's honestly unbelievable how they can face off against other squadrons just based off of brute force alone. So with the possible meta change, I think this could actually really help them out, especially put Formal back in kind of that main AR element along with an incredibly consistent gunless. You have back to form John and an improving Slacked. This team solely, like I said, just off of brute force, off brute skill, I think can topple a lot of teams that currently stand above them. And I think they're going to play a lot better from the Pro League heading into a LAN tournament where they're going to be feeling more in their element and with kind of not a whole lot to lose if you look at that point of view. So I think they're going to be looking a lot stronger than the top 8 team heading into Fort Worth. And I think they have the capability to be in that top 5, if not that top 4 discussion. Next team that I think has the capability to be a little higher is Splice. Now, when I say move a little bit higher, I mean maybe 1 spot. I'd be very gracious in saying 2. The reason why that matters is the higher you go, the more difficult it is. So to say that, Splice moving up 1 spot, that's actually huge considering the amount of talent that does exist. And there's going to be other teams that I mentioned, who I think could falter and, maybe fall 5 or 6 spots or raise a few spots. This is pretty much on the same caliber of that, if not even greater, by just solely 1 spot, like I said, based off of the competition that currently is out there in the Pro League or in the Call of Duty World League right now. Now, this has been a team I've been very aware of and been watching very closely throughout the entire Pro League, right? Similar to Luminosity, I have been worried about the internal struggles. I've been worried about the internal problems ever since they came into the very first event of the year and they started talking about the possible arguments, the arguments that they were having leading up into an event. And the biggest problem that we've seen with some of the best teams in the world is internal struggles. It's the ability for players to clash back and forth, for them not to work together. And while that possibly could continue on, I just don't see either Heretics or Genji taking them down on LAN. I really don't. Even based on the Pro League, from what we saw from Splice, and the big thing that was kind of thrown at them toward the end was, oh, they're lost to denial. And while I do hold a little bit on to that, to me, it's not as big of a deal as I think a lot of people are making it out to be. Yes, they did lose in a Game 5. Yes, they did have a 2-0 advantage. However, I think coming into that series, by no means were, at least in my opinion, I think that they were coming into that one thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be close. Oh yeah, this one is going to be one that we have to watch out for. I think that they were coming into that match not really putting a whole lot into it, and it obviously bit them in the end. So I think the way that they closed out the league, losing to Heretics 3-1, losing to Denial and E United, definitely kind of made me step back a little bit. However, I'm not ready to throw in the towel. I'm not ready to throw in the towel yet. I think one big factor for me regarding this team, as I mentioned with Formal and LG, is the possible ICR buff. And like I said, we've yet to know exactly how that patch will influence competitive, how it's going to change CWL Fort Worth. But if I were to think that accuracy's usability would skyrocket, it would be during this patch, which he seems to be one of their bigger problems in regards to just overall KD. So far in the Pro League, he averages out to a 0.84 hardpoint, a 0.69 search and destroy, and a 1.07 control. So at least as far as the first 2 game modes are considered, he's not really getting a whole lot done. And that's a total different performance than what we saw at Vegas, and a total different performance than what we saw throughout World War II, where he was regarded as one of the best ARs in the entire game. So I think if you can allow accuracy to get some space, that's only going to help out Jared to kind of be the entry to help set up temp. But for me, this will absolutely, if we start to see accuracy play better, I think this will be a direct reflection on how we see Jared play. Kind of like I said, if it frees things up, if it kind of allows the knowledge to be there, Jared on those close quarter engagements can do a ton of damage to a lot of other rosters. I think back to a number of different titles, even back to Infinite Warfare, where he was amazing with the FTL jump. Like, just his overall technical skill is unbelievable. We already know with how his shot punch potential is insane as well. So I think if we look to see maybe a few more pieces start to kind of be more consistent, possibly with a few weapons kind of getting tuned, I think that's only going to help the team and make them a much better squad moving forward. Now, my next and last team, I think we could see make a drastic change, is more typical. It's going to be a little more of a typical pick. It's Accelerate. I would be shocked if Accelerate looks worse. It looks like the worst team at CWL Fort Worth. They currently sit in 16th. I think one thing that can help them quite a bit is that they actually all currently have the same mindset. They're all thinking our organizations didn't think we were good enough, or if they did, they weren't willing to work with us. They all have the same mindset as we have nothing left to lose. We were the scraps, essentially, to a point. And for those who might be saying, oh, well, the Midnight players, Brack and Jet Li, they were barely on a team. Like, this decision for them to go to EXG was a very last-second move. So if they're feeling that way as well, it is warranted. So I think a lot of the players have a very similar mindset when it comes into this roster, as we barely made it on a team. We all come from the same point of view. Now let's try and show that we were worth it and how we can be a top team in the game, considering now the new record that most of them are going to have. So I think for this group coming in for the first time, if you're the SMG players, they work similar to Midnight, right? Because if you're Jet Li, you're still acting as an entry for a very fast SMG when you look at a guy like Profizi, who's obviously going to be in play for Envoy in this situation. Skies seems to like the Maddox more, especially when he was playing with another Maddox and Methods on UYU. Well, it just so happens that you have another dominant Maddox with you and likes to run that particular assault rifle a lot more as well, and Brack. So I think that this team isn't actually that much different than Midnight in terms of roles alone. Whenever you do look at guys like Ruiz in comparisons to Llama God, there is a few statistical differences, but if we do see a few performances start to kind of be brought up, you see a few players start to play more in sync, I think this team can actually be really good. My issue does come down to their pretty much their proficiency in respawns. I'm not sure if they're going to have the capability to take down teams like Splice and or Luminosity in their particular group. I think they're going to be more of a search and destroy team. So for me, I think that they have the capability to move up. How much farther, I'm not exactly sure, but by no means do I see them being the very worst, the 16th worst team in the Pro League. I think they're going to be, or rather in the standings, I think they're going to be a lot better than that once Fort Worth has concluded. Now let's move on and discuss a few teams that I think we'll actually see start to falter a little bit. Now I have to admit, these are much more difficult to predict. It's a lot easier to be positive and say, oh yeah, these guys are going to rise up. But I do feel as if we're going to see a few of these particular teams make a minor fall. These aren't going to be, catastrophic changes. Teams that are going to be plummeting toward the bottom of the power rankings after Fort Worth is over. It's not like that. I don't think we're going to see as dramatic of a change, but definitely could be seeing a few kind of roles swapping in the process in regards, like I said, to the power rankings. Now, one thing I think we could possibly see fall a little bit lower is Heretics. It hurts me to say that. It really does. I like Heretics a lot. I was all on the Vamos train, and I still am, but I am very aware of how they kind of closed out the Pro League. They started off 5-0, and they later saw a 3-0 defeat to 100 Thieves and a 3-1 loss to the boys in blue of Team Envy. Now, I don't see them beating any of my top 4 teams when it comes to LAN. I don't think they drop to Optic. I don't think they lose to 100T. I don't necessarily think they lose to Splice, E-United, or even Luminosity Gaming. I don't see them taking them down. And for me, it also is depending on, when you talk about another squad who could be up there as well, depending on Gen G, I don't know how they face off against them either, especially if they're losing respawns. And that to me was the biggest problem when they lost their series versus 100 Thieves, was that when they lose the first hardpoint, when they lose a series that, or rather a map combination that they feel comfortable in, we all know their very strong veto process that can go up against Heretics in regards to what maps they're really good at. If they were to lose in a dominant way in a respawn, or were to lose to a team who can kind of counter them like 100 Thieves, and we have to mention as well, in regards to that, a lot of the top teams in the game, when you talk about them, most of them are kind of more based around respawns. They're more based around the hard points, and you could also argue the controls. A lot of the teams that Heretics were facing off against, when you talk about United and a few others, they're not necessarily proficient when it comes into respawns, rather search and destroy based teams. So for me, my big thing with Heretics is how are they going to react to some of the best respawn teams in the world? How are they going to face off against them on a consistent basis? And the way that they concluded week 2 did worry me a tad, because they got dominated by 100T. They lose to Envy, who by no means was looking like a solid team in the Pro League. So this, to me, is going to be a big proving ground for Heretics to show after a slow finish to the Pro League that they can still be a consistent squadron. I think they're still a super talented team. I think they have a great core and Lucky, and if you have an on-point Journey and Metals, this makes for a very scary roster, a very fast-paced team that not many know how to deal with. However, if you're Heretics, I think working on your search and destroy game is important, and I think one thing that is going to be very good for them is this pre-land that is currently going on at the Hex quarters. I think that can really help them a lot, kind of fine-tune their game and figure out exactly how to improve. Now, another team that I think that also could see a little bit of a decline, possibly from the top 4 in this situation, is Genji. I want to point out that I was a fan of this roster move. I was a big fan of this roster move based on the decision that they made. If chemistry was no longer involved, with Spacely obviously being there, because that was a big fault of their game, or rather a big positive for their game was chemistry. Their 9-0 search and destroy record, however, a 10-11 in respawns type team. They were a great search and destroy team, but like I said, their respawns were negative. They just weren't performing in the respawns. I thought they definitely needed to kind of get more of a piece to that. Out of the 4 wins that they had in control, all 4 of those wins actually came by a 3-2 win, an overtime round victory. So for me, I think they started to realize, hey, we probably need to make a change. And so for me, that was warranted. I will say, though, I think with Optic and 100T being staples in my top 4, I think we also see Luminosity join the fray. I think Splice could possibly be there. United's around there. And then you also have to look at teams like Heretics, like I talked about just a second ago. How are those teams going to mesh when it comes down to facing off against Genji? And you could argue maybe losing a little bit of that search and destroy talent maybe could lead to them losing a few when it comes down to Fort Worth, could lead to them maybe dropping a few more rounds that they were typical to previously losing. And I don't think that this one player is going to totally revolutionize their respawn game, because like I said, some of the best teams in the world are respawn centric. When you talk especially about a team like 100T, who has been on the rise as of recent, they're necessarily relying on their search and destroy. By no means are they terrible at it, but when you look at their hardpoint and the players they have on the team, and the KDs that we've been talking about, and then you talk about their control, which has pretty much been one of their strong staple game modes throughout the entirety of the year. I mean, you're pretty much relying on a search and destroy, and you're hoping you could take one respawn off of them, when so far you've been 10 and 11 in it, and hardly any of your players have been positive outside of Mox. So I don't know necessarily if Envoy is going to totally revolutionize the roster. I look forward to seeing how this team will play, because I think they might lose a little bit when it comes down to that chemistry factor, which for me was a big portion of their game. Like I said, I do warrant the change. For me, it does make sense, but I'm not sure how this team would have. I think this team honestly would have declined more with Spacely if they would have came into this event of Fort Worth. So I think they do improve with Envoy, but I don't think they improve enough to stay in that top 4 region. I think we're going to see them fall a little bit. However, I am excited to see how this team performs when it comes into Fort Worth, but them in my top 4, definitely not convinced as of yet.